Hi, class. So today, this week, we're starting Module 13, which we'll be studying a classic letter from American political history, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And this follows our discussion of the Supreme Court and the court case that we studied. And here, Martin Luther King asks the fundamental question, which is, should all laws be automatically obeyed by people just because they're a law? So if something is a law, should we always obey it if we're good people? Because after all, what do we call people who do not obey the law on purpose, right? Society has this label, criminals. So should all laws be automatically obeyed? And the answer, of course, is no for Martin Luther King. The answer is it depends on what the law is and what it tries to do to people. Right? And this becomes kind of a famous statement of political philosophy of how to think about politics, including the government, the law, police, ethics. So it's a very straightforward module. We read the essay. It's a longish essay, but you have to read it carefully. It's a great essay. So we click on it. Sorry, I actually wanted to download it as a separate tab. And we begin reading. Notice just a little bit of context. Martin Luther King wrote it in 1963 when he was in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, to participate in local freedom civil rights protests against police brutality and violence against civil rights marchers and organizers. Pretty similar to what's happening around the country today with Black Lives Matter, but different, of course, because he's living in even worse times, racially segregated times. So he's there and he's being accused. Let's just wait. And here, before we get into the letter overview, as you start reading, I recommend you also start. So the response paper in this module is in the form of guided questions that you're supposed to answer in Microsoft Word or Google Docs, right? And think of these as like study questions related to the paper. Sorry. So as you read the document, have these questions in front of you, start up Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever, and start your response paper with question number 1. So these are the details it's kind of like a review, while at the same time helping us understand what MLK is writing about. So who is Martin Luther King writing this letter to? It's going to point your attention to as a hint. I don't know why it highlighted this. This is not working. Doesn't matter. So here it says, my dear fellow clergymen. Okay, so this gives you an answer to the first question. Think about who are clergy. Look it up if you don't know. But he's writing this letter to clergy. He's writing this letter to, in other words, other members of the church who are criticizing him for coming to Alabama, because he's not from Alabama, he's from Georgia. So more importantly, why is he writing the letter? And you're going to get into the third paragraph or thereabouts with MLK explaining why he's writing the letter. Next, this is a famous sentence. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. How do you understand that sentence? That's what this question is asking you to write about. How do you understand this question? This is a good question to ask in an exam also. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And maybe I should add this in the discussion forum. But do you agree or disagree? Because there's something about, he's saying here that if an injustice happens, if the police kill somebody for no reason, unjustifiable murder by the police, by the government, of somebody, and that somebody happens to live not in New York City, but on the other side of the country in Seattle, Washington State. Should we care? We're far away. I mean, something terrible happened, but we can't, I mean, we'll feel bad, but should we care beyond that, Martin Luther King is asking. After all, it happened many thousands of miles away. It's not in our community immediately. So some people might say, like some people said back in his time, if you are a Black person in Alabama, you should worry about police violence against you and people fighting for civil rights like you. But if you live in New York or Georgia, far away, you let the people in Alabama deal with it. It's not your fight. And MLK is saying the opposite. He's saying actually injustice anywhere in the country or even in the world should spark good people, people of good politics, good ethics. It should spark people who have good politics do something. Like you can't just sit there and be like, I'm glad it's not me, or I feel bad, but it's too far away. You have to find ways to get involved. Why might he say that? Well, the implication here is that anywhere there's an injustice, no matter how far away in your community, because the United States is our country, whatever happens in the US, sooner or later will affect New Yorkers too. Maybe directly, maybe indirectly. So if something messed up is happening in one part of the country, even if it's 4,000 miles away, sooner or later it's going to happen in New York City too. It's going to happen in our neighborhood too. So we should care. And we got to find ways to get involved to make sure that injustice is undone or it doesn't happen again. This is a justification for doing politics, right? Why do we protest? Why do we do resistance against, for example, racism in his case, or capitalist abuse of power and the rent being too high and people are left with no way to pay for their rent and they lose their apartments, and simply because the landlord wants to make even more money, but that displaces the community and that changes the neighborhood. These are injustices that we got to care about, even if our apartment is not threatened. Because guess what? If it happens to people in Williamsburg and they get displaced, it's going to happen to Queens too. It's going to happen to Jamaica eventually too. So everything is interconnected. Everything is interconnected. Everything that people do is interconnected. Societies are webs of people's ideas and interactions and actions. And if something happens here in this part of the web is interconnected. We're going to feel it in the other part of the web too. So injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Why? Because societies are interconnected webs of people, people's actions, people's ideas, and people's relationships. Everything is interconnected. The economy is interconnected. If 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 states are all of a sudden in an economic collapse, that's going to affect New York City too. So we need to learn and we need to get used to acting when injustices, when something horrible happens in society to other Americans for reasons that cannot be justified by reasonable, rational thinking people. And we got to act. Once we figure it out, oh, well, why is that happening over there? Oh, no, we're not going to let that happen. We got to do something about it. We got to organize. We got to figure out ways to resist. I mean, this is sort of what we're doing in this society today when people are finding different ways to plug in against police murder of Black people, or against real estate landlord abuse, or against pathetically inadequate and unfair and unjustifiably unfair healthcare in the time of a pandemic. People are finding ways, or trying to anyway. Some people do, some people don't. But those are the bad people, people who don't care about what happens unjustly to some other Americans in some other part of the country. Those are shitty people, pardon my French. They have bad ethics. They're bad people. They're going to be the problem. And we don't want to be people like that. Everything is interconnected. We got to pay attention to what happens in different parts of the country because everything affects everything. Question 4 is a technical question that's straightforward. Just find it and study it and describe it in your paper. What are the 4 basic steps in a nonviolent campaign? And again, number 5 is important. Number 5 is important. What does nonviolent action seek to achieve? I'll give you a hint. Nonviolent action is not about protesting. Nonviolent action is to protest in such a way that it interrupts everyday life, business as usual. So if you live in a messed up city because of messed up politics, and let's say it's divided, segregated racially, and the police are taking the side, the government is taking the side of the few racists and Klan terrorists, and you decide to do something about it, whether you're white or black, you got to interrupt business as usual in that city. You got to interrupt the flow of business. You got to interrupt the flow of the way people are driving down the streets. You got to interrupt the traffic. You got to do whatever you can to interrupt the flow of everyday routine life. One way to do that is protest. Another way is sit in the middle of the street, sit in the middle of the shopping mall, interrupt shopping. Go on strike if you're at work or if you're students or faculty. They did all those things. But the purpose of nonviolent action is to basically project force and shut down the city from its routine everyday life, which is racist, which is unfair, which is violent to a significant part of the population. So by shutting down the functioning of the city as usual, you are forcing the other side, that's the hope, to start talking to you, to start acting in ways that you want them to act. So it's a form of power. Nonviolent action is a form of political power, is a form of forcing the other side who's doing these unjustifiable things to your side, forces them to listen to you, or at least to act in ways that you want them to act. So pay attention to that. Those passages are very important. And lastly, number 6, which we're going to discuss in the discussion forum, define just and unjust laws. He does it several different ways. There are 2 different ways each, at least 2 different ways that he defines what is an unjust law, 2 different ways what is a just law. What's the difference between them? And then submit your paper here. Then move on to discussion forum. And the discussion forum has the following 3 questions. The first question, which is the most important, you're going to see on the test, how can we tell the difference between just and unjust laws? And I want your answers to try to be comprehensive, whatever, paraphrase what he said, put it in your own words, how he defines unjust and just law. Then in your opinion, does this matter to be aware of unjust and just law? Do you think this makes a difference in the way someone, you or us as Americans, live our lives? Can it affect our society? Can it affect our society, our politics? Knowing what a just and unjust law is and thinking about politics and laws in this way. Does thinking about laws in terms of whether they're just or unjust make a difference, do you think, in our society? So it's kind of, I'm asking you to think on your own about this based on his definition of just and unjust laws. And number 3, based on our discussion of question 1, give an example each. Give one example of unjust law and explain briefly, obviously, what makes it unjust. And one example of a just law in today. So that's basically what we are trying to do with this very important reading, because its implications are huge. Every intelligent, educated citizen, every American has to be aware of Martin Luther King's distinction of just and unjust laws, because this is the core of American politics. A lot of things happen through the law in America. So whether a law is designed to do certain things, we have to be immediately like, okay, this law makes me do this. Why? Does this make sense? A traffic law is an example of a just law, for example, because it aims to achieve a good thing, to prevent unnecessary deaths on the road through accidents because people drive too fast. So if you obey the traffic speed limit, chances are you are not going to cause a deadly accident. It's also fair for the cops to aggressively pursue you and fine you or arrest you if you are violating traffic laws, because you are actually doing something that's unjustifiable. By speeding, you are putting people at risk and yourself at risk, and that's not a good thing. You shouldn't be doing it. It's reasonable. So that's a good law. A traffic speeding law is a good law. It's a just law in this sense. Okay, what would make an unjust law? So just think about these things over next week. And that's basically it.